Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how to paint these windows with these beautiful flowery vines growing on them. I'm also really excited to tell you that I have a discount code and a link in the description below for my Polina Bright brushes. I've been using them on all of my YouTube videos, so feel free to check that out as well. So I'm starting off with sketching really simple arch shapes for my windows, and you can measure these out so they're exactly proportionate and the same as each other, but I kind of like the unevenness, and so I just sketched as best as I could and just kind of eyeballed it for the second one to match it pretty well. Now for this painting, I am going to be starting with using some masking fluid, and I always put some dish soap on my brush to protect it from the masking fluid because the masking fluid can ruin your nicer brushes. And so the masking fluid is going to serve one purpose really in this painting, and that's to maintain some of the white space. It's going to create a nice effect to be able to rub off at the end of the painting and have little white spots showing through. So once the masking fluid is completely dry after I've flecked it onto the paper, I am doing a really light wash of a brown color, and this is going to be the basis of my stones. And I want the paper to stay watery for when I add my pink flowers, because I want them to have that very soft blooming feel, so I want it to bleed a little bit into the paper. So the trick to this is you don't want your paper to be overly wet, and you don't want your wash of pink to be overly watery. So a light wash for the stones and then a highly pigmented pink wash. And really the trick of this is to just keep the flowers bunched up in certain areas and then do one or two off to the side just to make it look more organic and realistic. The right side of my paper was already pretty dry by the time I got my pink flowers over there, and so I did a very light wash of brown to re-wet the paper, and then applying the pink flowers on top of it, they were a lot more blooming and gave that desired effect that I wanted. My paper at this point is pretty much dry, so I'm using a mister spray bottle to spray down the whole paper because I really want my greenery to have that same effect, where some of the edges are really soft and it's blooming out, not necessarily mixing with the pink of the flowers, but just more of a random and organic feel to the way that they're moving across the page. So some of my strokes are small and have more of the jagged edge to represent the leaves, but also some of my strokes are wide and smooth to represent more of a bunch of leaves or a grouping of leaves that we can't necessarily distinguish the edges from. I'm not filling in every space. I want there to be gaps because that would be realistic, that there would be gaps between the leaves, and so you can see some of the wall behind it. I also am varying my lightness, so some areas are really washed out and light and some areas are darker. I also want to paint some viney parts that are kind of coming out in front of the window or reaching up out of the group up at the top, or kind of drooping down on the side under the window. So just keeping in mind the shape that I want to create, and having things sticking out in random spots will again contribute to that really organic feel. It's always easier to start with small, tiny strokes and then add more paint or bigger brush strokes to an area where it feels like it's too much, too busy, too small. The left side of my paper felt like the lines were too hard, and so I sprayed some of the greenery with my bottle and then really smoothed out the edges of the greenery to give it more of that same blooming feel that the right side has. Now that my paper is totally dry, I'm going in and adding more detail with a dark green pigment. Now with this painting, I really wanted to keep the feathery, light, blossomy feeling of the painting, so I'm trying to be very minimal about where I'm adding my more distinct dark leaves. So I'm not just going in and adding a dark leafy detail everywhere in my painting, because I really think by being minimal about it, it leads to a more impressionistic feel that your eyes are already grasping that this is greenery, and so you don't need every leaf spelled out. So it just was an artistic choice for me, but I really like how it turned out. So I'm doing some really dark and very specific leaves, but then I'm also doing some more muted, softer mid-tone leaves that are more blotchy feeling and not as detailed. And I think that really starts to help everything pop, even though not every leaf is specifically outlined. Okay, so now we're going to add the detail to our flowers. And these aren't necessarily any type of specific flower. In my mind, I was painting a really bushy bougainvillea type flower. And so I'm doing the same type of technique I did with the leaves, where I'm really only detailing a few very small aspects of each flower, and I'm not overwhelming each blossomed area with dark details. So just keeping it really light so that you know that there are close-up detailed flowers, but then the bloomed fuzzy flowers are the background flowers that you know are there, and so your mind automatically fills in those gaps. I'm also adding a lot of little tiny blooms to the end of some of our hanging vines that we had, and I really just feel like it finishes everything off because these pink flowers really stand out when they're not hidden by the green. Also, remember that in this painting, it is totally encouraged for everything to be asymmetrical because the vines would not grow in the same way. Now we are going to work on the stones of our building. And I was referencing an inspiration picture, and there were a lot of stones that were different sizes, and some had jagged edges, some had smooth edges. But the most important thing to keep in mind is to just make sure that they're staggered. You don't want the stones to be directly on top of each other. It won't look as natural or organic. And so I just used a light brown color and used the side of my brush to kind of swipe across the paper to make all different kinds of shapes. So after my stones were dry, I went back and added a golden brown color to some of the edges. This just helps to add dimension and contrast, makes the stones look like they're popping out so they're not quite as flat. And now we are going to work on our windows, and I really feel like this is when the painting starts to pop because of that added contrast with the black. So the first color we're going to lay down is a lighter gray, just to get the tones down there. And you don't want to forget areas of the window frame that are poking out behind the greenery. That's going to be really important to make it look realistic because we left some of those areas open and we want to make sure to fill those in. For the glass in the window, I'm keeping the color really light, as if a lot of light and sun is reflecting off of the window. So I'm just keeping it a really light gray color, and I'm using that wet on dry technique where I swipe my brush across the paper and let some of the white paper come through because of the texture of the paper. I'm also adding a lot of gray next to the greenery on the window to create shadows of that greenery that's falling across the window. Once all of that initial color of gray has dried, I'm going in with my really stark black, highly concentrated pigment of paint and really defining all the edges of this window frame. I'm imagining that my light source is coming from the upper left, and so I wanted to make sure and add some shadow to this part of the plant. It's really the only area not on the windows where some of the shadow would be. And I think this is probably my favorite part, when you remove the masking fluid and you see that beautiful white space come through. It just really almost makes the painting sparkle and adds such a neat contrast and dimension to the entire piece. And of course, taking the tape off is so satisfying as well. And that is it. Thank you so much for being here today with me while we painted this piece. I really loved how this one turned out, and I hope that you try it and see that it may not be as complicated as you might have thought. And I will see you guys next time. Bye.